while we're just doing the transition, I'll start to introduce our second speaker of this session, who comes here from the Distance University in Madrid. And so the second speaker in this session on emotions in the history of psychology will be Noemí Pizarroso, and she will be talking about a fairly unknown book. I now see from reading the abstract. This is Henri Wallon's La vie mentale, and looking at that within Febvre's Encyclopédie and his historiographical project, and particularly looking at the role of psychology in the early history of emotional life.
Good morning. May I leave it here?
Yes, I think it ran. Right.
Okay, good morning. Well, in this presentation, I try to shine some light on an item published in France in 1938, volume 8 of the Encyclopédie française, La vie mentale. This volume is of special interest for the history of 20th century French psychology, and particularly for analyzing the relationships between history and psychology, yet it unfortunately tends to be overlooked. Particularly, I will focus on Wallon's psychology of emotions in the framework of this volume and its significance within Febvre's history of affectivity. To do so, I will start with a brief presentation of the Encyclopédie project and volume 8 in particular. I will follow this with a brief presentation of Wallon's psychology of emotion as sketched out in this volume. And lastly, we shall see what place this psychology occupied within Febvre's historiographic project. The volume La vie mentale is part of the Encyclopédie française, one of the first compendiums to challenge the popularity of the Larousse Encyclopédie in the first third of the 20th century. The Encyclopédie française was part of an ambitious cultural, humanistic, republican project backed by Anatole de Moncy, who was France Minister for National Education at that time. The responsibility of directing this great project was entrusted to Lucien Febvre, then teaching in University of Strasbourg, but about to enter the Collège de France. Paradoxically, the Encyclopédie was both Febvre's most ambitious project and his less known project. In fact, bibliographies of his work tend to gloss over the Encyclopédie or ignore it altogether, probably because of the feeling that writing encyclopedias, like writing reviews, is a second-rate line of work. The Encyclopédie française floats the regular encyclopedia's rule of alphabetical classification and uses classification by topics.
You don't record? Okay, that's okay.
Instead. In fact, it is not even reorganized into disciplines but into problems. Febvre took care to handpick each volume's director and to work with them to plan the table of contents and writing team. He also wrote the preface and or conclusion of too many of the volumes, and he penned many entries himself. The result is a collection of 20 monographs in which, curiously enough, history as a discipline of the past does not occupy an especially prominent position. As a whole, however, the Encyclopédie is a sort of mouthpiece for Febvre's conception of history. Not by chance is the first volume about l'outillage mental, a key concept in Febvre's approach. To direct volume 8, Febvre chose no other than Henri Wallon. Wallon was a close friend to Febvre since l'École Normale Supérieure. After their aggregation, Febvre and Wallon also spent their early years as teachers together at the Lycée Bar-le-Duc, and they were to become colleagues again from 1937 on at the Collège de France. Let's go with the volume. In his preface to the volume, Febvre presented the volume as a groundbreaking, almost outrageous arrangement that scrapped the old psychology of faculties and delved instead into the different stages of the development of the human psyche within its context. Wallon, too, advised readers of the volume's approach. He made it clear that he would be striving to trace the genesis of psychological life using a genetic and comparative method in which each object would be approached on three planes. First, according to the way the object functions normally, then from a pathological perspective, and lastly, when the object so allowed from an animal perspective. The volume was divided into three major parts. First, the stages of psychological development. Second, circumstances and objects of mental activity. The second part deals with the family, school, work, daily life, and public life. And third, the levels of mental life. In this last part, the contents are assembled into a hypothetical lifetime and split into two major sections, an ascending period and a period of decline. To write the multiple component chapters of each section, Wallon assembled 28 contributors, 3 of them women. Well, I will not dwell into this on this slide because I'm short of time. Anyway, while most of the contributors were responsible for a specific chapter or section, Wallon's hand is evident throughout, especially in the volume with entries in practically every section. In fact, he wrote at least a fourth of the volume. Wallon's contribution to the volume, which almost form a book in themselves, cover aspects of his work on neurological issues, emotions, and applied psychology. But they also raise issues more closely related with intellectual function, which Wallon was to address in his later work. Here we will focus on his development on emotions, which appears in the section on the beginning of sociability. Wallon saw a tie between the study of emotions and the issue of movement in the psychological development of the child. After having devoted his PhD dissertation to motricity problems related to neurological deficiencies, such as coordination problems, tics, and delayed motor development in l'enfant troublé, Wallon suggested that there was a motor component of human personality, the postural function, which he wrote about in Les origines du caractère chez l'enfant. The first thing a child perceives about the situation, he said, is the child's own tonic muscular reaction of comfort or discomfort, which has to do with the satisfaction or dissatisfaction of the child's needs. This tonic reflex reaction, Wallon believed, was an early form of emotion at the point where it becomes a mode of expression, the basis of a child's first exchange with other people. During the first 2 years of life, the child requires the mediation of others to satisfy his or her needs. Relationships with others stand head and shoulders above the child's direct relation with the external environment. Emotions like pleasure, happiness, anger, distress, fear, or shyness are a new form of activity that differs from the automatic reactions provoked by the outside world. They belong to the realm of interindividual and collective relations. Wallon thought that peripheral theories, like James, and intellectual theories, all fell short of the mark. Emotions oscillate constantly between the physical and the mental. I quote him, "A visceral change without affective consequences has no emotion about it. Once awakened, an emotion feeds on its own effects and sometimes forgets what originally caused it." Wallon used the term emotional narcissism to refer to that sort of self-complacency under whose influence we dramatically wallow in the manifestation of some of our emotions, even the most sincere ones. But this kind of loop, as we might call it, is not enough to explain emotion. Mere physiologically based postural activity would mean nothing if it did not involve an affective mode of reaction in the persons around us in our social environment, because l'homme physiologique cannot be separated from l'homme social. According to him, emotions turn into a system of inter-individual incitements which has gradually become diversified according to situations and circumstances, and which in its turn diversifies each person's reaction and sensibility. Emotions are ultimately an institution. The existence of this first sphere of inter-individual relations, of a human milieu, is the breeding ground where intellectual instruments develop, starting with language, particularly articulated speech. Emotion, which springs from motor activity, thus becomes the jumping off point for intellectual activity. That said, a relationship of antagonism and incompatibility is established between emotion and intellectual activity. The emotional sphere, which lies at the origin of the intellectual sphere, appears as something that disturbs the intellectual activity and can in turn be subjected to a certain rational control. These ideas, as we'll see, will be taken up by Lucien Febvre in the third, and like we will see now in our third and last section. Febvre and psychology. Well, Febvre had dabbled in psychology from the early days of his career as a contributor of Henri Wallon, the founder of the Revue de Synthèse, who explicitly called for the publication of articles on the psychological interpretation of history. In 1929, Febvre, together with Bloch, founded another journal, Annales d'histoire économique et sociale, the source of the name of the well-known Annales School of Historiography. In Febvre's way of understanding history, we find the footprint of Durkheimian sociology and its various ramifications concerning the study of collective consciousness, in addition to the unavoidable reference to Lévi-Bruhl and his famous La mentalité primitive. Febvre bore the heavy footprint of the collective psychology of Charles Blondel, a colleague of Febvre at the University of Strasbourg. This influence is evident in the entry he wrote for the introduction to the volume La mentale, one of the most important entries he contributed to the entire Encyclopédie, and considered one of the key texts in Febvre's historiographic work. After reminding readers that the great discoveries are made on the edges, in the gray areas between sciences, Febvre wrote of the advisability of finding relations between psychology, sociology, and history. While theoretically, at least, ties seem to have been established between these disciplines, he said, there was still a long way to go before those ties would be real and appropriate. Firstly, Febvre exposed the misguided anachronism of using 20th century psychology to interpret the emotions, decisions, and reasoning of individuals from other eras. This form of psychological anachronism, which is so frequently found in history, is the worst of them all, I quote him, the most insidious and the most serious. With his colleague Blondel, Febvre claimed that universal forms of feeling, thinking, and acting may not exist. Without resorting to extreme cases like Lévi-Bruhl's primitives or Marcel Granet's Chinese world, Febvre asserted that clearly different mentalities do exist. One need only look at, for instance, the cruelty with which the dying were treated in the ancient regime, or the intensity with which emotions were expressed in the Middle Ages, facility of emotions, givenness to tears, as told by Dutch historian Johan Huizinga in Le Déclin du Moyen Âge. Febvre was not, however, content with describing these differences. He aspired to explain them and he strove to do so by resorting to contemporary material conditions, such as the contrast between night and day, softened today by electric light, or changes of temperature between seasons, insecurity, and food. He thus proposed to reconstitute the physical, intellectual, and moral universe of a historical collectivity, which included inventorying the mental baggage of an era, what he called the outillage mentale. To do so, he insisted, and I quote him again, "It's obvious that the descriptions and findings of a psychology that operates only on the basis of data relative to our time are no good, as obvious as is the fact that the true historical psychology can only be possible through a clearly negotiated accord between psychology and history." A short time later, in 1941, Febvre took his psychological foray further with a view to tracing out the history of emotions. Here, he insisted on the need to stay abreast of psychological research, without which there is no possible history. Febvre exposed how conventional history, erudite history, the history of events, has thus far used psychology basically only to throw light on the behavior of certain personages. Febvre criticized the kind of cheap psychology used in such cases, pompous psychology based on aphorism and quotes from literature. Exactly what he does in this article is to issue a strong invitation to introduce another psychology into a history of ideas and institutions, and particularly to think of a history of affective life and its manifestations. To do so, Febvre suggested looking at Wallon's handling of the emotions in the Encyclopédie. Few readings, he wrote, can prove as clarifying to a historian in search of clarity. In fact, practically half of the article is a detailed exposition of Wallon's thesis on emotions, which I will not repeat. After recalling the filial and opposing relationship between emotions and the intellectual sphere, Febvre considers that the history of civilization would then appear to be in fact a rejection of emotional activity by intellectual activity. The greater the technological and intellectual development, the more barefaced the expression of this rejection. He believed that this pattern enabled historians to gain a better grasp of the attitude of the man of other kinds, and even helped define a research method. Accordingly, Febvre suggested re-examining the life of contrast that Huizinga described as a particular trait of the Middle Ages, the exact subject Febvre had addressed in his previous article. Given the universal nature of the ambivalence of feelings, the question to ask was not, does the life of contrast form a special separate period in human affective history? The right questions, in Febvre's view, are there periods of greater or lesser contrast? Are there periods in which some tendencies, like grace, outweigh others, like death? Are there periods in which intellectual life outweighs affective life, or vice versa? Why? How? The point, in short, is to reconstitute the affective life of another era, an endeavor that is as alluring as it is difficult, but one that we have no right to avoid. Febvre then addressed the need to study the affective history of humanity in the light of genetic psychology, concerned with linking the meaning that men of one age give their ideas to the set of conditions for existence in the age. This was a difficult task, and the instruments for doing it were hard to come by and tricky to handle: vocabularies and dictionaries, artistic iconography, literature, and all while keeping in touch with the latest psychological research. But Febvre wound up by appealing to all these as yet unmade histories, a history of love, of death, of pity, of cruelty, or happiness, which are so timely today. As a whole, I conclude, the Encyclopédie turned out to be pretty much a commercial flop. It performed far below expectations in terms of circulation, in addition to being used very little and rarely cited today. Even so, Volume 8, and most particularly Wallon's ideas on the emotions, had a considerable influence on Febvre's later work. This influence, however, seems to have gone largely unnoticed by later historians of emotions. Febvre's criticism of psychological anachronism, using 20th century psychology to interpret the emotions, decisions, and reasoning of individuals from other eras, has become an essential reference and seemingly dismisses any reference to this discipline. Yet, the norm has been to ignore the fact that he bases his proposal on a genetic psychology that is especially mindful of the constitutive role of social life, as in Wallon's idea of psychology. Bearing in mind how unescapable this seminal text of Febvre's is in the field of history of emotions, I think it makes sense to take another look at the problem of the relations between psychology and history, and most particularly the question of which psychology of emotions for which history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noemí. So once again, we have between 5 and 10 minutes for questions, and then in fact, there isn't a third paper in this session, so I suggest we ask some questions and then we can let people go who want to see the third paper in the other session, but perhaps continue. So are there some initial questions here? Okay.
Thanks for your information-rich contribution. But behind it are two big problems. The term emotion is a romantic creation and a novelty in around 1800. So there is a trouble to introduce the whole problem under this name. There's another question. Behind the whole story in France are two new phenomena. The introduction of phenomenology, yes. Maurice Merleau-Ponty is the outcome of that, and the introduction of psychoanalysis behind it. And I'm a little amazed that it had not a role in your introduction.
Okay, because I just wanted to focus on the influence of Wallon developments on Febvre. It's a very small subject, if you want. Merleau-Ponty comes later, and he doesn't make part of the volume. But I'm not talking about the influence of psychology in general in the history of emotions, but I really wanted to focus on this first chapter in this seminal text by Febvre, who is the reference to which every historian of emotion currently refers to as the father of the
For historians like Febvre, a big grand man for 30 years in France, the basic term is anachronism. And how can you construct a history of the psyche without tackling this problem? And essential for the whole idea of history is anachronism is something to be pressed, hold it away. And so we have introduced a lot of modern new terms for old histories.
I don't know if I am understanding properly your question. What I wanted to highlight is that together with his criticism of anachronism, which is clear, I mean, he's against this use of anachronism. He's not throwing away any reference to psychological theories or psychological research, and he's trying to show how a genetic psychology and social psychology can also help historians to think their questions, the questions to ask, to to the materials regarding the past.
How to create a history?
I think
In this
Come
case,
in.
you can continue in the break, but let's leave some space for someone else to ask a question or make a comment. So, yeah. Anna?
I had a question on, you showed a list of all these people making contributions.
Yes.
From what kind of, like, I'm saying disciplines with quotes, right? But from what kind of disciplines were they? Especially thinking about the fact that it was such a big part on normal psychology and not only pathological. So we're from anthropology, from
Most of them are psychologists. We have psychiatrists too, like Malikowski. Most of them are psychologists. I mean, the big psychologists of the time at La Sorbonne and the Collège de France, like Delacroix, Dumas, Paul Guillaume, Pierre Janet. But we have also from psychoanalysis Lacan and Lagache, and from psychiatry Minkowski, from sociology Friedman, George Friedman, when he speaks of labor and work. But most of them are psychologists. The volume is on La Vie Mentale. This is the specific volume on the whole project of the
Yeah,
Encyclopédie.
but I was thinking like La Vie Mentale can also be very sociological, perhaps because it's about normal, not about pathological psychology. So that was my question.
Well, Wallon's approach was very sensible to social aspects, and in fact we have also Charles Blondel, who is the representative of the collective psychology influenced by Kenyan sociology. So this question is covered in the volume.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to propose a question about the sequence of this meeting between history and psychology. We have this meeting between Wallon and Febvre, but how it was the situation of both disciplines after this first meeting? For instance, by the side of psychology, there was an effort to connect more with history by one side, and for the side of history, there was the other generations of the École des Uned to have a more strong contact with psychology. How it was for both disciplines in France?
Well, this is a kind of single event in the relation of the two disciplines. As you know, psychology tried to separate from social and historical concerns. Historical psychology of Meyerson had a difficult time to keep on existing within the field of psychology, and finally he went to the École des études anciennes sociales with Febvre. On the side of history, after Febvre, only Robert Malraux, his disciple, continued this line of historical psychology, but the other members of the school were more oriented toward economical or social aspects more than psychological. It has been only later that this history of sensibility has been recovered.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think this is an opportune time to thank Noemí once again for a wonderful paper.